Hi everyone, my name's Miss Marzoni and today we will be making a soap dish on legs. And what better time to be making a soap dish than while we're at home quarantined and washing our hands over and over again. For this project, you'll probably need about a pound of clay. You can use a little bit less or a little bit more. I'm using about 1.3 pounds of clay. It depends on what kind of soap dish you'd like to make. I'm making a little bit larger of a rectangular one, so I'm using about 1.3 pounds of clay, but you can make it any shape or size you'd like depending on what you have at home. Make sure you save yourself some for some future projects as well. The next tool you'll be using is a slab mat. If you don't have a slab mat, don't worry. There are other things that you have at home that you can be using, like parchment paper or wax paper or waxed canvas if you have any, or regular canvas as well, but you'll need to tape all of those down to a surface, whatever surface you'll be using to make your soap dish today. If you don't tape them down, then it's going to slide all over the place. You'll of course need a rolling pin for this. If you don't have a rolling pin at home, you can always use a wine bottle. Any kind of glass bottle that's a cylinder will work great. Just make sure that if you do use a rolling pin that you either wrap it in wax paper or parchment paper so that the clay doesn't get stuck to the rolling pin. This rolling pin right here is my clay specific rolling pin, so that's why I don't have wax paper taped to it. The shape I'm making my soap dish is a rectangle. I'm using a 4x6 note card as my stencil, and you can make yours any shape that you want. You will also need a few tools. One is a needle tool, which I think you guys all have at home. An X-Acto knife, optional but very helpful. And I know you guys don't have this tool, but I like to use this tool for cutting out my drainage holes. But instead today, I'm going to use a needle tool like all of you guys to make the drainage holes. You'll need a sponge. And you'll need 2 dowels, or 2 things that are exactly the same width as each other. We're using these in place of our slab roller, since we're not all lucky enough to have a slab roller at home. I'm using 2 square dowels that I found in the garage. They're about a 1/2 inch deep, I guess, so when I roll my clay out in between these two, it'll turn out like a 1/2 inch thick. You can use something a little less. I wouldn't go any more than a 1/2 inch though, because any more might warp in the kiln. Any less than maybe 3/8 an inch might warp in the kiln also. But you can get creative with this. Look around your house or in your garage. Sometimes I've used wooden spoons in the past that had the same size handle. You can roll out in between those. You could also roll out in between 2 books with the same size spine. That would need to be covered in parchment paper as well, so it doesn't get ruined. Find something in the garage. I'm sure that you have dowels or curtain rods hanging or laying around. You can get creative with this tool. The next thing you'll need will be some slip, and I like my mini whisk. I'm very proud of my little tiny mini whisk for mixing my slip. You of course don't have to have a mini whisk. You can use a fork. A fork will do just fine. Now that we have all of our tools figured out, we can get going. All right, so I'm tapping out my clay in between my 2 dowels. I'm going to start rolling it out. It's okay if there's a few air bubbles. We can pop those later. They might pop on their own. I'm rolling it out so that it's even all around. If it overflows onto your dowels or your books or whatever you're using, that's totally fine. You can wipe it off. And then we'll place our stencil on our rolled out piece of clay. And you can use your X-Acto knife or your needle tool to cut out the stencil. And then I'm going to save my excess because we're going to need some of that for our legs. Now I'm putting my rectangle onto the board that I'll be drying out my piece on later. I'm going to wet my sponge and wipe it out and smooth out the edges so it's nice and clean. Now I'm going to take my needle tool or my X-Acto knife, whichever you prefer to use, and I'm going to start cutting the drainage holes. You can make a stencil for your drainage holes if you want them to be absolutely perfect. I am going to eyeball them and see how they turn out because I usually use that loop tool, but I'm not using that today. So I'm going to go ahead and try out just eyeballing them and see how it goes. You want to start your first drainage hole far enough away from the edge so that you have a place to place your legs on the bottom once we're done. So I'm doing mine probably about a ½ inch away from all the edges. And so far so good. Now let's speed it up. So as you can see, they're not all perfectly symmetrical, but if you've ever heard of a Japanese term called wabi-sabi, it's actually what it means is finding beauty in the imperfections. I like to think of that when I am making anything with clay, because it's always going to turn out a little bit funky and weird, and if you can learn to accept that, you'll be much happier with your pieces in the end. Okay, now that we've waited for our piece to dry out a tiny bit, not too much, it's just a little bit more stiff and solid, we can go ahead and clean up our drainage holes. I like to use the X-Acto knife for this. I can make the corners of my drainage holes a little bit more rounder and cut out those little edges that were left behind from our first cutting with our needle tool. Now that I'm a little bit happy with that, I'll take my sponge and I'll wet it, and then I'll rub it inside of the drainage holes to make them more smooth and symmetrical, and clean them up and make sure there's no rough edges inside of there. Also, you can wipe down your edges and round the corners of them if you'd like. I always like to take my finger and run it along the inside of the drainage holes to smooth them out even more after the sponge. Now I'm going to go ahead and clean up my workspace so that I can get ready for adding the legs. I'm going to grab some of my excess clay that I saved from earlier when I was cutting out my rectangle. I'm going to roll it into a ball. Sometimes I like to get it a little bit wet. The clay tends to dry out when you're rolling it into a ball, or when you're rolling it out on a table or on wood surfaces, it'll dry out a little bit, so I like to add water to it to keep it nice and moist. I'll roll it in between my hands first, and then I start rolling it on the table, where I put my hands in the middle of the piece and roll outward, and that tends to keep it more even. I want my legs to be about as thick as a pinky. So as you can see here, that's about as thick as my pinky. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut my legs. I throw away the end piece and save a little piece. This is going to be my first leg, and it's about the tip of my pinky. You can make your legs as tall or as short as you like. This tends to be a good size for me. Any taller, sometimes your piece might warp, so be careful, but you can still play around with it and have fun. And now I'm going to wipe my piece down again, clean it up before I add the legs. Have my slip all ready. I think a good consistency for slip is like a little bit runny of a pudding. Now I'm going to score one end of each of my 4 legs, and then I'm going to score each corner of the bottom of my soap dish. I like to go kind of deep with my scoring just to make sure that the slip really gets into the piece and that the legs don't break off. Now I'm going to add some slip to each leg. And when I press it on, I kind of listen for like a popping noise. It sounds like the air is trying to escape between those cracks in your scoring. I think that's a great noise. It makes me feel like the leg is solidly on there now. After I press them down on my piece, I'm going to go ahead and smooth out that extra slip around the edges of each leg. I use a sponge and my finger and kind of wipe it smooth. Make sure there's still no clean cracks visible, and that you can see the leg is solidly on there. The legs will tend to bend while you're doing this part, so just make sure that you're keeping them as straight as possible so that your piece lays flat on your counter or your sink in the end. And I think that's it. I'm going to lay my piece with the top side down on my board and wrap it in plastic for it to dry out. The next day, I get to unwrap my piece and check how it's drying, making sure those legs are on there solid and everything's nice and smooth. And then I test to see if it's even or level, and making sure that not one leg is longer than the other, which I did find. You can tell if one leg is longer because it'll be a little wobbly on your table. So I just trim them down with my X-Acto knife, and now it's level. And I'm going to wipe down the legs with a sponge just to make sure they're nice and smooth, and then I'm going to let it dry. Make sure you sign your name in your piece, and congratulations, you guys just made your first soap dish.